Hello, hello. Welcome to another Tale of Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. Today, we are continuing our story of Reanimator. We left off on Act 2, or we finished Act 2 and Act 1 the other night. So today, we're going to be doing Act 3 and 4. So, for those of you that are unfamiliar with this tale or need a recap as to what has occurred, uh, at the beginning. During Act 1 and Act 2, they were describing a man named Herbert West. This man had devious plots to reanimate the dead. And throughout Act 1 and 2, it is speaking of his experiences at the college he was attending and how he was dealing with the morality of explaining the morality of reanimating the dead and how people that were working in the field thought of it as kind of like a joke, or they thought of it as unethical to really think of investing into. And then by the end of Act 2, we have a we have an event that causes a big stir. I'm not gonna necessarily spoil anything. If you want to check that out, you can go to the readings playlist on my YouTube down below. In the bio, there should be a YouTube link that you should be able to click on. It'll take you to the YouTube channel. You can check out the playlist on there for Tales of Horror. I got Act 1 and 2 on there already, so you can go check that out. So grab your blankies, grab your snacks, because it's time for a tale of horror. Act 3. 6 shots by midnight. It is uncommon to fire all 6 shots of a revolver with great suddenness when one would probably be sufficient. But many things in the life of Herbert West were uncommon. It is, for instance, not often that a young physician leaving college is obliged to conceal the principles which guide his selection of a home and office. Yet that was the case with Herbert West. When he and I obtained our degrees at the medical school of Miskatonic University and sought to relieve our poverty by setting up a general practitioner's, we took great care not to say that we chose our house because it was fairly well isolated and as neat as possible to the potter's field. Reticence such as this is seldom without a cause, nor indeed was ours, for our requirements were those resulting from a life work distinctly unpopular. Outwardly, we were doctors only, but beneath the surface were aims far greater and more terrible. Moment. For the essence of Herbert West's existence was a quest amid black and forbidden realms of the unknown, in which he hoped to uncover the secret of life and restore to perpetual animation the graveyard's cold clay. Such a quest demands strange materials, among them fresh human bodies, and in order to keep supplied with these indispensable things, one must live quietly and not far from a place of informal internment. West and I had met in college, and I had been only one to sympathize with his hideous experiments. Gradually, I had come to be his inseparable assistant, and now that we were out of college, we had to keep together. It was not easy to find a good opening for 2 doctors in company, but finally, the influence of the university secured us a practice in Bolton, a factory town near Arkham, the seat of the college. The Bolton Wurst Mill are the largest in the Miskatonic Valley, and their polyglot employees are never popular as patients with the local physicians. We chose our house with the greatest care, seizing at last on a rather run-down cottage near the end of Pond Street. 5 numbers were the closest neighbor, and separated from the local potter's field by only a stretch of meadow land, bisected by a narrow neck of the rather dense forest which lies to the west and to the north. The distance was greater than we wished, but we could not but we could get no nearer houses without going on the other side of the field, wholly out of the factory district. We were not much displeased, however, since there were no people between us and our sinister source of supplies. The walk was a trifle long, but we could haul our silent specimens undisturbed. Our practice was surprisingly large from the very first, large enough to please most young doctors, and large enough to prove a bore and a burden to students whose real interest lay elsewhere. The mill hands were of somewhat turbulent inclinations, and besides their many natural needs, their frequent clashes and stabbing affrays gave us plenty to do. But what actually absorbed our minds was the secret laboratory we had fitted up in the cellar. The laboratory with the long table under the electric lights, where in the small hours of the morning we often injected West's various solutions into the veins of the things we dragged from the potter's field. West was experimenting madly to find something which would start man's vital motions anew, after they had been stopped by the thing we called death, but had encountered the most ghastly obstacles. The solution had to be differently compounded for different types. What would serve for guinea pigs would not serve for human beings, and different human specimens required large modifications. The bodies had to be exceedingly fresh, or the slight decomposition of the brain tissue would render perfect reanimation impossible. Indeed, the greatest problem was to get them fresh enough. West had had horrible experiences during his secret college researches with corpses of doubtful vintage. The results of partial or imperfect animation were much more hideous than were the total failures, and we both held fearsome recollection of such things. Ever since our first demonic session in the deserted farmhouse on Meadow Hill in Arkham, we had felt a brooding menace. And West, though a calm, blonde, blue-eyed scientific automaton in most respects, often confessed to a suddening sensation of stealthy pursuit. He half felt that he was followed, a psychological delusion of shaken nerves, enhanced by the undeniably disturbing fact that at least one of our reanimated specimens was still alive. A frightful carnivorous thing in a padded cell at Sefton. Then there was another, our first, whose exact fate we had never learned. We had fair luck with specimens in Bolton, much better than in Arkham. We had not been settled a week before we got an accident victim on the very night of burial, and made it open its eyes with an amazingly rational expression. Before the solution failed, it had lost an arm. If it had been a perfect body, we might have succeeded better. Between then and the next January, we secured 3 more. 1 total failure, 1 case of marked muscular motion, and 1 rather shivery thing. It rose of itself and uttered a sound. Then came a period when luck was poor. Internments fell off, and those that did occur were of specimens either too diseased or too maimed for use. We kept track of all the deaths and their circumstances with systematic care. One March night, however, we unexpectedly obtained a specimen which did not come from the potter's field. In Bolton, the prevailing spirit of Puritanism had outlawed the sport of boxing, with the usual results. Surreptitious and ill-conducted bouts among the mill workers were common, and occasionally professional talent of low grade was imported. This late winter night, there had been such a match, evidently with disastrous results, since two timorous Poles had come to us with incoherently whispered entries to attend to a very secret and desperate case. We followed them to an abandoned barn where the remnants of a crowd of frightened foreigners were watching a silent black form on the floor. The match had been between Kid O'Brien, a lubberly and now quakely youth with a most un-Hibernian hooked nose, and Buck Robinson, the Harlem Smoke. That's a word I can't say. The N word had been knocked out, and a moment's exclamation shrewd us that he would permanently remain so. He was a loathsome. Oh God, this sentence is really okay. Pardon me. The sentence is from the book. It's not me. Okay, he was a lonesome gorilla-like thing with abnormally long arms, which I could not help calling forelegs, and a face that conjured up thoughts of unspeakable Congo secrets and tom-tom poundings under an eerie moon. The body must have looked even worse in life. But the world holds many ugly things. Fear was upon the whole pitiful crowd, for they did not know what the law would exact of them if the affair were not hushed up. And they were grateful when West, in spite of his involuntary shudders, offered to get rid of the thing quietly, for a purpose I knew too well. There was a bright moonlight over the snowless landscape, but we dressed the thing and carried it home between us through the deserted streets and meadows, as we had carried a similar thing one horrible night in Arkham. We approached the house from the field in the rear, took the specimen in the back door and down the cellar stairs, and prepared it for the usual experiment. Our fear of the police was absurdly great, though we had timed our trip to avoid the solitary patrolmen of that section. The result was wearily anticlimactic. Ghastly as our prize appeared, it was wholly unresponsive to every solution we injected in its black arm. Solutions prepared from experience with white specimens only. So as the hour grew dangerously near to dawn, we did as we had done with the others, dragged the thing across the meadow to the neck of the woods near the potter's field, and buried it there in the best sort of grave the frozen ground would furnish. The grave was not very deep, but fully as good as that of the previous specimen. The thing, which had risen of itself and uttered a sound, in the light of our dark lanterns we carefully covered it with the leaves and dead vines, fairly certain that the police would never find it in a forest so dim and dense. The next day, I was increasingly apprehensive about the police, for a patient brought rumors of a suspected fight and death. West had still another source of worry, for he had been called in the afternoon to a case which ended very threateningly. An Italian woman had become hysterical over her missing child, a lad of 5 who had stayed off early in the morning and failed to appear for dinner, and had developed symptoms highly alarming in view of an always weak heart. It was a very foolish hysteria, for the boy had often run away before, but Italian peasants are exceedingly superstitious, and this woman seemed as much harassed by omens as by facts. About 7 o'clock in the evening she had died, and her frantic husband had made a frightful scene in his effort to kill West, whom he wildly blamed for not saving her life. Friends had held him when he drew a stiletto, but West departed amidst his inhuman shrieks, curses, and oaths of vengeance. In his latest affliction, the fellow seemed to have forgotten his child, who was still missing as the night advanced. There was some talk of searching the woods, but most of the family friends were busy with the dead woman and the screaming man. Altogether, the nervous strain upon West must have been tremendous. Thoughts of the police and of the mad Italian brought weighted heavily. We retired about 11, but I did not sleep well. Bolton had a surprisingly good police force for a small town, and I could not help fearing the mess which would ensue if the affair of the night before were ever tracked down. It might mean the end of all our local work, and perhaps prison for both West and me. I did not like those rumors of a fight which were floating about. After the clock had struck 3, the moon shone in my eyes, but I turned over without rising to pull down the shade. Then came the steadily rattling at the back door. I lay still and somewhat dazed, but before long heard West's rap on my door. He was clad in dressing gown and slippers, and had in his hands a revolver and an electric flashlight. From the revolver, he knew that he was thinking more of the crazed Italian than of the police. "We'd better both go," he whispered. "It wouldn't do not to answer it anyway. And it may be a patient. It would be like one of those fools to try the back door." So we both went down to the stairs on tiptoe, with the fear partly justified, and partly that which comes only from the soul of the weird small hours. The rattling continued, growing somewhat louder. When we reached the door, I cautiously unbolted it and threw it open. And as the moon streamed, revealing down on the form silhouetted there, West did a peculiar thing. Despite the obvious danger of attracting notice and bringing down on the heads of the dreaded police investigation, a thing which after all was mercifully averted by the relative isolation of our cottage, my friend suddenly, excitingly, and unnecessarily emptied all 6 chambers of his revolver into the nocturnal visitor. For that visitor was neither Italian nor policeman. Looming hideously against the spectral moon was a gigantic misshapen thing, not to be imagined save for nightmares. A glassy-eyed, ink-black apparition nearly on all fours, covered with bits of mold, leaves, and vines, foul with caked blood, and having between its glistening teeth a snow-white, terrible cylindrical object terminating in a tiny hand. Wow. And that concludes Act 3. That last sentence was crazy, right? So it's literally the guy that they buried came back to their house and still has the freaking shot like hanging from his arm, dangling there. That's crazy. All right, now for Act 4. The screams of the dead. The screams of a dead man gave to me that acute and added horror of Dr. Herbert West, which harassed the later years of our companionship. It is natural that such a thing as a dead man's scream should give horror, for it is obviously not a pleasing or ordinary occurrence. But I was used to similar experiences, hence suffered on this occasion only because of a particular circumstance. And as I was implied, or as I have implied, it was not of the dead man himself that I became afraid. Herbert West, whose associate and assistant I was, possessed scientific interests far beyond the usual routine of a village physician. That was why, when establishing his practice in Bolton, we had chosen an isolated house near the potter's field. Briefly and brutally stated, West's sole absorbing interest was a secret study of the phenomena of life and its sense and its cessation, yeah, of life and its cessation, leading towards the reanimation of the dead through injections of an excitant solution. For this ghastly experiment, wow, I can hardly see from here. Hold on. See if I can turn on the lights a little bit brighter. Oh, yeah, that's way better. Okay. The reanimation of the dead through injections of an excitant solution. For this ghastly experimenting, it was necessary to have a constant supply of fresh, very fresh human bodies. Very fresh because even in the least decay hopelessly damaged the brain structure. The human beyond, because we found that the solution had to be compounded differently for different types of organisms. Scores of rabbits and guinea pigs had been killed and treated, but their trail was a blind one. West had never fully succeeded because he never been able to secure a corpse sufficiently fresh. What we wanted were bodies from which vitality had only just departed. Bodies with every cell intact and capable of receiving again the impulse towards that mode of motion called life. There was hope that this second and artificial life might be made perpetual by repetitions of the injection. But we had learned that an ordinary, natural life would not respond to the action. To establish the artificial motion, natural life must be extinct. The specimen must be very fresh, but genuinely dead. The awesome quest had begun when West and I were students at the Miskatonic University Medical School in Arkham, vividly conscious for the first time of the thoroughly mechanical nature of life. That was 7 years ago. That was 7 years before, but West looked scarcely a day older now. He was small, blond, clean-shaven, soft-voiced, and spectacled, with only an occasional flash of a cold blue eye to tell of the hardening and growing fanaticism of his character under the pressure of his terrible investigations. Our experiences had often been hideous in the extreme. The result of the defective reanimation, when lumps of graveyard clay had been galvanized into morbid, unnatural, and brainless motion by various modifications of the vital solution. One thing had uttered a nerve-shattering scream. Another had risen violently beaten us both to unconsciousness and run amok in a shocking way before it could be placed behind asylum bars. Still another, a loathsome African monstrosity, had clawed out of its shallow grave and done a deed. West had had to shoot that object. We could not get bodies fresh enough to shrew any trace of reason when reanimated, so had perforce created nameless horrors. It was disturbing to think that one, perhaps two of our monsters still lived. That thought haunted us shadowingly, till finally West disappeared under frightful circumstances. But at the time of the scream in the cellar laboratory of the isolated Bolton cottage, our fears were subordinate to our anxiety for extremely fresh specimens. West was more avid than I, so that I almost seemed to me that he looked half covetously at any very healthy living physique. Ooh, so he's like lusting for physiques. It was in July 1910 that the bad luck regarding specimens began to turn. I had been on a long visit to my parents in Illinois, and upon my return found West in a state of singular elation. He had, he had told me excitingly, in all likelihood solved the problem of freshness through an approach from an entirely new angle, that of artificial preservation. I had known that he was working on a new and highly unusual embalming compound, and was not surprised that it had turned out well. But until he explained the details, I was rather puzzled as to how such a compound could help in our work, since the objectable staleness of the specimen was largely due to delay occurring before we secured them. This I now saw. West had clearly recognized creating his embalming compound for future rather than immediate use, and entrusting to fate to supply again some very recent and unburied corpse, as it had years before when we obtained the bad word, killed in Bolton prize fight. At last, fate had been kind, so that on this occasion there lay in the secret cellar laboratory a corpse whose decay could not by any possibility have begun. I'm guessing that they might be talking about like embalming solutions, maybe formaldehyde, stuff like that. What would happen on reanimation, and whether we could hope for a revival of mind and reason, West did not venture to predict. The experiment would be a landmark in our studies, and he had saved the new body for my return, so that both might share the spectacle in a custom fashion. West told me how he had obtained the specimen. It had been a vigorous man, a well-dressed stranger just off the train on his way to transact some business with the Bolton Worston Mills. The walk through the town had been long, and by the time the traveler paused at our cottage to ask the way to the factories, his heart had become greatly overtaxed. He had refused a stimulant, and had suddenly dropped dead only a moment later. The body, as might be expected, seemed to West a heaven-sent gift. In his brief conversation, the stranger had made it clear that he was unknown to Bolton, and a search of his pockets subsequently revealed him to be one Robert Levitt of St. Louis. Apparently without a family to make instant. If this man could not be restored to life, no one would know of our experiment. We buried our materials in a dense strip of woods between the house and the potter's field. If, on the other hand, he could be restored, our fame would be brilliantly perpetually established. So, without delay, West had injected into the body's wrist the compound which would hold it fresh for use after my arrival. The matter of the presumably weak heart, which to my mind imperiled the success of our experiment, did not appear to trouble West extensively. He hoped that at last to obtain what he had never obtained before, a rekindled spark of reason and perhaps a normal living creature. So on the night of July 18th, 1910, Herbert West and I stood in the cellar laboratory and gazed at a white, silent figure beneath the dazzling arc light. The embalming compound had worked uncannily well, for as I stared fascinatingly at the sturdy frame which had lain 2 weeks without stiffening, I was moved to seek West's assurance that the thing was really dead. This assurance he gave readily enough, reminding me that the reanimating solution was never used without careful test as to life, since it could have no effect if any of the original vitality were present. As West proceeded to take preliminary steps, I was impressed by the vast intricacy of the new experiment, an intricacy so vast that he could trust no hand less delicate than his own, forbidding me to touch the body. He first injected a drug in the wrist just beside the place his needle had been punctured when injecting the balming compound. This, he said, was to neutralize the compound and realize the system to a normal relaxation so that the reanimating solution might freely work when injected. Slightly later, when a change and a gentle tremor seemed to affect the dead limbs, West stuffed a pillow-like object violently over the twitching face, not withdrawing it until the corpse appeared quiet and ready for our attempt at reanimation. The pale enthusiast now applied some last perfunctory test for absolute lifelessness, withdrew satisfied, and finally injected into the left arm an accurately measured amount of vital elixir, prepared during the afternoon with a greater care than we had used since college days, when our feet were new and groping. I cannot express the wild, breathless suspense with which we waited for results on this first fresh specimen. The first we could reasonably expect to open its lips in rational speech, perhaps to tell of what it had seen beyond the unfathomable abyss. West was a materialist, believing in no soul and attributing all the working of consciousness to bodily phenomena. Consequently, he looked for no revelation of hideous secrets from gulfs and caverns beyond death's barrier. I did not wholly disagree with him theoretically, yet held vague instinctive remnants of a primitive faith of my forefathers. For that I could not help eyeing the corpse with a certain amount of awe and terrible expectation. Besides, I could not exact from my memory that hideous, inhuman shriek we heard on the night we tried our first experiment in the deserted farmhouse at Arkham. Very little time had elapsed before I saw the attempt was not to be a total failure. A touch of color came to the cheeks, hitherto chalk white, and spread out under the curiously ample stubble of sandy beard. West, who had his hand on the pulse of the left wrist, suddenly nodded significantly, and almost simultaneously a mist appeared on the mirror inclined above the body's mouth. There followed a few spasmodic muscular motions, and then an audible breathing and visible motion of the chest. I looked at the closed eyelids and thought I detected a quivering. Then the lids opened, shewing eyes which were gray, calm, and alive, but still unintelligent and not even curious. In a moment of fantastic whim, I whispered questions to the reddening ears, questions of other worlds of which the memory might still be present. Subsequent terror drove them from my mind, but I think the last one, which I repeated, was, "Where have you been?" I did not yet know whether I was answered or not, for no sound came from the well-shaped mouth. But I do know that at that moment I firmly thought the thin lips moved silently, forming syllables I would have vocalized as "only now." If that phrase had possessed any sense of relevancy, at that moment, as I say, I was elated. I was elated with the conviction that the one great goal had been attained, and that for the first time a reanimated corpse had uttered distinct words impelled by actual reason. In the next moment, there was no doubt about the triumph, no doubt that the solution had truly, no doubt that the solution had truly accomplished, at least temporarily, its full mission of restoring rational and articulate life to the dead. But in that triumph there came to me the greatest of all horrors. Not horror of the thing that spoke, but of the dead that I had witnessed, and of the man with whom my professional fortunes were joined. For that very fresh body at last writhing into full and terrifying consciousness, with eyes dilated at the memory of its last scene on earth, threw out its frantic hands in a life and death struggle with the air, and suddenly collapsing into a second and final dissolution, from which there could be no reason, screamed out the cry that all ring eternally in my aching brain. "Hey, Bob, you cursed little towhead fiend, keep that damn needle away from me." And that concludes Act 4. Wow. Crazy, right? For the first time, I love this sentence. In the next moment, there was no doubt about the triumph, no doubt that the solution had truly accomplished, at least temporarily, its full mission of restoring rational and articulate life to the dead. Wow, that's such a cool little sentence right there, man. Came the greatest of horrors, not horrors of the thing that spoke, but of the dead that I had witnessed, and of the man with whom my professional fortunes were joined. Oh, that sudden realization, dude. Now that is a way to write suspense, right? You're so focused on this body laying on the floor. You're so focused on if the solution is going to work to bring this body back to life. And then in just the last couple sentences of this act, you're finally confronted with the realization of the real horror in the room is not the reanimating. It is the morality of these scientists. It's the morality of, should these people be doing what they're doing? All followed up with the final sentence of this act. Help. Keep off, you cursed little towhead fiend. Keep that damn needle away from me. Such good suspense, am I right? That's such a good piece of writing. Granted, this author is known to be very racy, and I apologize to all you that probably were not very prepared for that. But great piece of writing though, right? It's really well done. Beyond that. And I can't wait to show you guys the movie tomorrow. We're going to be finishing up Act 5 and 6 tomorrow, following up with maybe a watch party for the actual movie. But that concludes Acts 3 and 4 of Herbert West's Reanimator. If you liked the story reading, make sure you hit the like and subscribe down below. Leave a comment if you like as well. I really appreciate it. It helps out with the algorithms. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. It'll let you know when I'm posting up any of the new videos or anything like that. If you want to watch live, I usually am on Twitch, twitch.tv/stigmaxoxo. So make sure you go follow that and hit the notification button. I appreciate you guys all that stopped by and are watching this YouTube video. Please, please, please have a good night. Don't let the Cthulhu's bite. And don't stay stranger. Bye. I'll see you on the next one. There should be some playlists that are going to be popping up on this side of the video. Go check those out. The Grimm's Tales are on this side. And then the Tales of Horror will be on this side. So go check those out. Bye, 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 bye. Bop, beep, boom, bum, bum, bum. Ba, la, la, da, da, boom, bum, 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 bum.